All right, let's dive into a question that I think a lot of us have bumped up against. Why are ancient spiritual texts so incredibly hard to understand sometimes? We're going to explore some fascinating source material that lays out a whole framework for this, and honestly, it might just change the way you think about words themselves.
So, have you ever picked up one of those classic texts, started reading, and within a few pages just felt completely and utterly lost? Yeah, you are not alone. It's an almost universal experience, and it turns out there's a reason for it. The source we're looking at today actually breaks down that confusion into 5 clear obstacles that we can wrap our heads around.
So here's the game plan. First, we'll look at what our source calls spirituality's hidden language. Then, we'll get into the trouble with words themselves, what's been lost in translation over the centuries, the major clash between ancient and modern worldviews, and finally, we'll talk about what it means to go beyond the intellect.
Okay, let's start with the big one. The central idea from our source is that these texts are basically working on 2 different levels at the same time. There's what's written on the page, and then there's what's really being said.
The source breaks this down into literal meaning and implied meaning. The literal meaning? That's just the surface-level dictionary definition of the words. But the implied meaning? That's the deeper spiritual understanding that you can't get just by reading. You kind of have to experience it. And this single distinction is the master key to everything else we're about to unpack.
So, if there's this deeper meaning baked into these texts, what's stopping us from seeing it? Well, the first hurdle, and this is kind of ironic, is language itself. The very tool we're using to understand can actually be the biggest wall between us and the meaning.
Okay, check this out. The source uses math to make this point in a really cool way. In our day-to-day world, 1 + 1 is 2. Always, no question. But in what it calls spiritual math, you get this. 1 guru plus 1 disciple equals 1 guru. Now, how in the world does that work? Well, the implied meaning here is that the disciple's individual identity is supposed to completely merge with the guru's. All of a sudden, it's not about math at all. It's about a total transformation of self.
And this isn't just some weird one-off example. Look at how these super common everyday words get a complete makeover. To us, ignorance is just not knowing stuff. But in a spiritual context, it's the fundamental error of believing you are your body or your mind. Success isn't about getting a promotion, it's about making spiritual progress. They're using the same words, but they're pointing to completely different universes of meaning.
Now, to really drive this point home, the source brings up a very famous and, yes, pretty controversial verse. And just a heads up, we're looking at this specifically to understand this idea of layered meaning, just as it's presented in our source material.
So here's the verse. A direct, literal translation has often been interpreted to mean that a drum, a fool, a person of a so-called low caste, an animal, and a woman are all deserving of being controlled or even beaten. And you can see immediately why this literal reading is deeply, deeply problematic for any modern reader.
But then, our source presents a completely different symbolic interpretation. In this view, none of those words refer to external people or things. They all represent parts of yourself that need discipline. The drum is your eardrum, always distracted by outside noise. The fool is your own intellect, ignorant of spiritual truth. The animal is your own untamed breath. And the woman, here, symbolizes the tongue, which can chatter endlessly. Suddenly, the verse transforms from a horrifying social command into a personal instruction for self-mastery. It's a really stark example of how literal and implied meanings aren't just different, they can be worlds apart.
Okay, so if this deep, implied meaning exists, why is it so hard for us to see it? That brings us to our second big obstacle. We are missing a huge amount of context that, back in the day, everyone would have had. Take a look at this number, 195. That's it. According to our source, that's the total number of verses in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. The entire vast science of yoga, condensed into just 195 tiny lines. I mean, think about that. That's shorter than many articles you'd read online. This crazy level of condensation is a huge clue to our problem.
And here's why that matters. These texts were never meant to be standalone books. They were more like a professor's lecture notes. They were memory aids, bullet points that a guru would then spend years, even decades, explaining and unpacking for a student. But over the centuries, a lot of that direct, person-to-person teaching has been lost. So now we're often left holding just the notes, but the entire lecture is gone.
So what exactly are we missing? Well, according to the source, a ton. Things like the practical, how-to advice, direct explanations of these hidden, implied meanings, and even analysis comparing different spiritual approaches. All of that stuff was part of the oral tradition that went along with the text.
But it's not just about missing history.
There's another massive hurdle. Our own modern way of thinking is often in direct conflict with the entire worldview that created these texts in the first place. It's like trying to run an app on the wrong operating system.
I mean, look at this. This is a fundamental clash of goals. Modern Western psychology, for the most part, is about understanding and developing our personality. It's about strengthening our sense of I. But the spiritual science in our source is aiming for the exact opposite, to dismantle that personality, to dissolve the sense of I altogether. When your fundamental goals are polar opposites, it's no wonder the instructions seem totally alien.
The source also points to a philosophical clash. It notes that while only about 5% of the world's population identifies as atheist, that particular viewpoint can create an instant barrier. Why? Because these ancient texts were written from a place where a higher power wasn't something to be proven, it was the assumed fundamental starting point of all reality. If you don't share that basic assumption, a lot of the concepts just won't compute.
And that idea extends to what our source calls the rationalist mindset. It draws this really sharp contrast here. The rationalist demands external objective proof before they'll believe anything. But the seeker, in this model, often takes the word of the text or the guru as the starting point for their own investigation. It's a completely different approach to what proof even means, and that can make these texts seem impenetrable from a purely rationalist stance.
All of this brings us to the final and maybe the most crucial obstacle our source material identifies: the limitation of the intellect itself. Sri Shankaracharya put it so perfectly here. The web of words is a great forest that causes the mind to wander. The idea is that if you rely only on your analytical mind, you can get tangled up in the words forever, analyzing and debating, and completely miss the actual path through the forest.
The source uses a brilliant analogy for this. Think about a weighing scale. It is a perfect tool for measuring weight. But you would never use it to try and measure something like acidity, right? It's just the wrong tool for that specific job. The argument here is that our intellect is just like that scale. It's an amazing, powerful tool for what it does, but it simply cannot measure or grasp things that are purely experiential, things like spiritual realization, which are outside of its function.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's not that the intellect is bad or useless. Not at all. It's the starting point. It's what gets you in the door. You use your mind to understand the concepts and to start doing the practices. But the ultimate goal, according to this spiritual science, is to arrive at a direct, personal experience of the truth, a way of knowing that happens beyond the thinking mind.
So that's the framework our source gives for why these ancient texts can feel so dense. But it kind of leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? One that goes way beyond old books. If the words on a page can have such profoundly different layers of meaning, what about the situations in our own lives? What in our jobs, our relationships, or even in the way we see ourselves? Might we be reading far, far too literally?